Hi booktube, Aaron here, hope you're doing very well. Today I'm going to be going through the books that I read in March and then going through some of my plans as they stand at the moment for the month of April. So I made a reading, like a random reading update about a week or two ago. So I've gone through a number of the books that I read in that video. And so I'll just quickly tell you what they were. So first up we've got the collected or new and collected poems by George Szirtes. I need to do a Poetry Thursday sort of featuring him because I really enjoyed his poetry and was sort of bringing him up every now and then as I was reading him in reading updates and wrap-ups and things, and sort of running out of things to say, and so I need to sort of read some of his poems individually, I think, in order to give you a better idea of what I like about him. And then on my Kindle I read a book by James Romm. I don't have it up here at the moment, but it was called A Ghost on the Throne, and it's all about what went on after the death of Alexander the Great. And it was fascinating, and I really enjoyed it. It was, I think it was probably my favourite thing I read in the month of March. It was really remarkable. I loved the way he wrote. I just was entranced by the story of it all, by the stakes, and yeah, it was really wonderful. I had one small quibble with it towards the beginning, but I think in context it sort of worked itself out, and that was how he was saying that Alexander's empire was a sort of multi-ethnic empire, and sort of a cosmopolitan sort of empire. And from what I understood and from what I was actually reading in the exact same book where this is being said, I'm reading about invasions and, cities under siege and, essentially people really not having a choice but to join up to Alexander's project. And I had that little quibble there where, yes, compared to what came afterwards, it was relatively cosmopolitan. He took on, sort of various elements of the cultures that he had subjugated after conquering them, so there's sort of that element, but again it's almost an appropriation more than a celebration of these various cultures. So I wasn't entirely sure where I stood with him sort of trying to big up Alexander's cosmopolitanism. Maybe had Alexander lived longer and we would have got a clearer and stronger idea of what that kind of society might have looked like, then maybe, but instead he dies younger, things fall apart, and we end up with a system of various groups fighting for power and infighting, and these various deals and treaties with each other, and then there's backbiting and treachery. And the argument that Romm makes towards the end of the book then is that that's very much the world that we're still in. It hasn't really changed since then. And so it was interesting, and I liked the way he built up to that point. However, I still have that little quibble about, what would it be like to be just a normal person in a hill fort in just the I don't know, modern day Uzbekistan, to have these Macedonians come take over your town, sort of take provisions, kill your comrades, and then take on your culture, and you're supposed to sort of enjoy that. I don't know, I didn't quite get it, so that was where my quibble was. Anyway, without going into too much detail, the next two, just dropped a book, but the next two were Giant Moth Perishes by Geoffrey Nutter, just a lovely poetry collection. And then the book that I dropped on the floor here it is The Conference of the Birds by Farid ud-Din Attar, which again, I'll link down my reading update that I'd already made, because I had a few quibbles with that as well. But it'll be one I'll be coming back to in the future, I think, to reassess. And then on to what I've actually read since those books. The main book, the book that took up the most of my time in March, I was reading it for March, of The Mammoths, which is a booktube event created by Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse. And the idea is you pick up a book that is 800 pages or more. That's sort of the categorization of a mammoth, and you just have to read it. That's all you have to do. You don't have to finish it in March. I managed to finish my mammoth in March. As long as you start it in March, then you've participated in March of the Mammoths, and it's, I think, my favourite booktube event because I love big, baggy books. But I also just love the simplicity of it because you could just read anything for March of the Mammoths. And the book that I read was The Strudlhoff Steps by Heimito von Doderer. This is a rather nice and swanky looking edition from New York Review of Books. It's translated by Vincent Kling. It's got an afterword by Daniel Kelman, which, had it been the introduction, may have actually turned some readers off. I mean, there are spoilers in there, but it goes into just sort of some of the elements of Doderer's personal life and his political affiliations that, if you just sort of glanced at it in an introduction and didn't think about it, and maybe didn't have time to try to sort of reconcile certain elements of his life, then maybe you wouldn't want to read the book. Maybe I'll go into that first before going into the book itself. So essentially, the thing that might turn you off from reading The Strudlhoff Steps by Heimito von Doderer, he was Austrian, born in the very late 19th century, so was a sort of middle-aged man by the 1930s, and he signed up and joined the Austrian Nazi Party, which was at the time, in the early 30s, illegal. So the Anschluss hadn't happened yet, so it was still, Austria still had its sovereignty, and I suppose there was a bit more hostility to these sort of ideas in Austria than there was in Germany at that point. And so being a Nazi in Austria at that point was illegal, but he joined up anyway. And then I can't remember whether it was after the Anschluss or before, so whether it was before or after Germany annexed Austria. He sort of distanced himself from the Nazi Party. He would describe it later in life as the sort of a brutal period of his life. He certainly had anti-Semitic tendencies, and apparently part of the really petty reason for him joining the Nazi Party was that he was a failing writer, and he thought he might get a better chance of being a writer under under the Third Reich than under the world he saw at the time. And he had all these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. I can't help but think that he must have thought that there was some element of this idea of there being some kind of elite keeping him out of the world of letters, and that then suddenly makes all these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories more appealing to him. That's sort of what I was thinking from reading it. But anyway, he distances himself. The anti-Semitism seems to sort of die away over time. Later in life, he seems to happily collaborate and sort of work on projects with Jewish writers, and so it does seem like it was just for a specific moment of his life. But Kelman, in the afterword, says, sort of powerfully and quite, and it's an important thing to note. He never ever acknowledged, he said that he had been a Nazi and that he distanced himself. He converted to Roman Catholicism, and yet he never apologized for any of it, and so there's that really slightly distasteful ambiguity then to him. Is he just sort of flowing in the sort of tides of political fashion, or is there something else going on? I'm not sure, and I think it should leave a slightly bad taste in your mouth. And so that, yeah, it was. I think it is something worth knowing before reading it, because you maybe don't want to pick up an 800-page book, read the whole thing, and then be surprised that he'd formerly been a member of a far-right party. So just bear that in mind. Anyway, that was a bit of a ramble about the author himself. I'm still a bit ambiguous about that, and did my best not to let his personal life colour my feelings for the book itself. Unfortunately, I then had rather ambiguous and rather, well, maybe ambiguous is the wrong word, but because I think I do know what I think about the book, but I have conflicting feelings about the book. There are elements of it that I loved, and elements of it that I thought were really odd and really strange. It's a big book about Vienna just before and just after the First World War. So the first section sort of covered is 1908 to 1911, and then there's 1923 to 1925, and they're not neatly separated. Most of the action of the book is in the later period after the First World War, but we begin in around 1923 or maybe 1925, and we're jumping backwards and forwards all the time. So it's rather disorientating. So it's something else to bear in mind. And there's a whole cast of characters. On the back, it says, it's sort of bigging up how potentially diverse this cast of characters are, that there are, sort of almost aristocrats all the way down to shopkeepers and street urchins. Well, there are no street urchins in the book, really. There are some shopkeepers in there, a few honest working class people. They tend to show up quite briefly, and if there are any characters who start off in sort of with a sort of working class background, or a sort of trade background or something like that, it's forgotten relatively quickly, and they sort of blur into the sort of general, I don't know, sort of unformed aura of whatever class the main characters are. I mean, they mainly consist of lower and upper class people. So there are people who have second homes out in the country, and then other people who are maybe bankers or clerks or things like that in the city, and can afford to go visit them and spend time off and maybe live it up, and order champagne and things, but they're not quite as well off as these other upper middle class people. In terms of plot, in terms of story, there are kind of two main characters. I think really the central character is a character called Colonel Melzer. I think it's Melzer or Mesler. I think it's Colonel Melzer, if I'm remembering correctly. And he's, sort of gone up through army school, and in the First World War goes down to Bosnia and Serbia, and a big part of his story is the trauma of one of his comrades dying, and in sort of various little flashbacks we slowly get the picture of what happened to his comrade, and really the slow realization isn't what happened but how deeply it's affected Colonel Melzer. And he's skirting on the edge of the main sort of two class groups of the novel, of these sort of lower middle class and upper middle class. He's sort of somewhere between the two. He can sort of fade in and out. He's got the respectability of having grown up in the military and served, his officer class in the military as a colonel, and yet he's not really got that much money. And after the First World War, after Austria becomes a republic rather than part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he ends up working, I think, in the civil service, and he's essentially an administrator for the tobacco coming in and out of Austria. That's his job, and so he's got a rather boring, not terribly well-paying job in the government. So that's where he's ended up, and it's about him and a whole cast of other people around his age, some a bit older, some a bit younger, and their various affairs and friendships and tiny little but still consequential scandals, and that whole element of it, I think you might be able to tell from the way I don't really have much to say about it, did leave me a bit cold. It didn't feel like that whole world had come alive for me. There are some garden parties, some soirees, and things, and yet the whole book, particularly when you have this massive cast of characters, it felt like the narrator knew all these people and expected that I already knew them too. It gets me wondering whether this was like a roman, what do they call them, like a roman cleft or something like that, a roman cleft. So it's sort of like autofiction, where all the characters are based on real people, people that the author knows, and the author sort of anticipates that most people that are going to read the book will also know them. And part of the fun of reading it is working out who is who. Certainly there are two characters that are modelled on von Doderer. One is the other sort of main character, a guy called René Stangler, and Stangler is one of the main families in the book. And then there's another older gentleman who we meet very briefly, who I think is one of the main characters in one of Doderer's other books, The Demons. I think what I enjoyed about this was there were certain elements, certain moments where the writing was just lovely, and the Strudlhoff steps do become, they're a real sort of public staircase I think in a park in Vienna. And they do have a certain significance in the book. They're a place of chance meetings and of significant moments, and that there are some really lovely moments that describe it. And I'm trying to remember if there's a section that talks about them that I could share with you. Okay, so I found this one section. It took me a while because I didn't leave any notes in the book at all, because I have this love-hate relationship with it. I wasn't sure. I rarely leave notes, and so I wasn't really keeping much track of passages that stood out. But there's a moment here where the steps sort of stand out a little bit, and one of the elements, I think, there's this sort of almost disquiet to them, I suppose, or that they're a moment of quiet in a bustling city, in a book full of characters going everywhere. So Melzer, the colonel, has gone out for a walk, and he's made sure that he's including the steps in his route. So here it goes. So it says, then Melzer turned back and went down the steps, ramp after ramp, and felt for the first time now that he was alone, the presence of greenery in the night, as if that aroma had required complete silence and solitude to manifest itself. And indeed, the steps once more contrived to be altogether deserted, in spite of an hour not at all advanced. So that idea that they have their own kind of agency, and that they are sort of turning moments to their own purposes, and that purpose at that moment is peace for Melzer, but there are other elements, other moments where instead there are these chance encounters. There's a lovely moment when Melzer's there where it almost takes on a religious, almost sort of pagan element. It's almost like a deserted temple in another passage that I was trying to look for, but it wasn't where I thought it was. I did, however, remember one passage, and this will show you just I suppose the two ends of von Doderer's writing. So they're these really beautiful lyrical moments, and then every now and then it's just really, really bad, the writing. And this is maybe the worst paragraph I've ever read in a novel. It's two characters in an amorous encounter. They stood this way for a long time and gobbled each other up. It felt like that to Melzer, all the while kissing their way through a mountain of sweet mush amassed over a whole summer to the gates of love's never, never land. It's just awful. And I think that's the thing. I couldn't quite get what kind of book this was. I couldn't quite get what he was trying to get at. I don't think he particularly penetrated the inner workings of any of these characters enough for it to be interesting. There's a really random plot that develops towards the end of the book that is interesting, but in a kind of crazy vintage dime store kind of way. And then in the last 100 pages, I got what I wanted from the book, which was this sense of all these various lives going on their own strands and suddenly being knit together in a single moment. And that's what I was expecting, and I did get it. But it took 800 pages, and ultimately I didn't quite think it was worth it. And so, along with the author's life and with actually the work as it was executed, unfortunately this mammoth was a bit of a dud. I mean, I have a middling response to it. There were still moments I enjoyed. However, considering its size, I would struggle to recommend it to just anyone, I think. And then on to the next few books that I finished. I moved on with a series that I've been reading this year called The Mirror Visitor by Christelle Dabos. And they're translated from the French by Hildegard Searle. And I read the second book, which is called The Missing of Clairdelune. The first book is called A Winter's Promise. These books are about a young woman called Ophelia. She's in a world where the world is torn apart and humanity is separated on the various fragments, which are called arcs. Each arc sort of has its own family spirit, is what they call them. These semi-divine immortals who have a terrible memory and yet are very powerful. And from them, the inhabitants of these arcs develop certain powers. So on Ophelia's home arc of Anima, it's all connected to objects. And so Ophelia herself has two main powers. she can read the not quite the history of an object, but the history of the feelings of the people who have touched that object in the past. So she can sort of gather a history of the object by touching it through the other people who have touched it in the past. So that's one thing that she can do. The other thing she can do is she can pass through mirrors, provided that she's been to the place on either side before, and she can visit and she can visualize it, and that those two places aren't too far apart. So there are her two main gifts. The plot of the first book, The Winter's Promise, is about her arranged marriage, and she has to go to the pole, a distant arc in the far north, where everything's very different. There's still an aristocracy, there's lots of backbiting and the chance of assassinations and intrigue and all of that. And her fiancé, Thorn, is the treasurer to the family spirit. No one likes him, and nothing is quite what she expects. She has to go into disguise. She has to pretend that that she's not there. It's a sort of secret that she's actually there. By the end of The Winter's Promise, things unfold and it can't be kept secret any longer. And so with the beginning of The Missing of Clairdelune, she is presented to the court and presented to the family spirits of the pole called Farouk. And in this book, Farouk initially appoints Ophelia a position because they need to be protected. The family, Thorn's family, is in danger. Many of them have just been killed, and he's afraid that his aunt, who is looking after Ophelia, and himself and Ophelia are all in danger. And the safest place to be is under the watchful, well, not really under the watchful eye, but under the official protection of the family spirit. And for that, they need to go to court. And so she's given this position as the vice storyteller. It doesn't go too well. And then there are all these strange disappearances. And so it sort of becomes a bit of a mystery as to how are these people disappearing and why. And it's all to do eventually with why the world is how it is. And I don't really want to say too much about this book. They sort of work things out. And the first two books, so A Winter's Promise and The Missing of Clairdelune, sort of both form a kind of, I think together, a really one big book, which are very elegantly and simply giving you the world building in a way that doesn't feel like it's not an info dump at all, but instead it feels very natural and you're just being given the world. So I'd recommend that the series I read, so this one, and then I went on to the next book in the series, which was the first one where it felt much more like a sequel, called The Memory of Babel. It's set a few years after that book, and Ophelia has been separated from Thorn. I'll spoil things slightly, but by saying that they're now married, and yet they, after their marriage, are immediately separated. And she's had to go back to her home arc, and yet there's still a mystery in the background. And from various clues that she's been given, she's deduced that she needs to go to this arc called Babel, which is where the memory of kind of the memory of the whole world is kept, and it's very, very elite. And there's this massive library in essentially the Tower of Babel that's been rebuilt. And the lovely little symmetry that I found in The Memory of Babel, it was how Babel was the sort of central point of the old world before it fragmented, and then it fell apart. I just loved that little sort of doff at the hat, that little reference there. I thought that was really great, and there are lots of sort of literary references all through that. I think Voltaire comes up. I think it's Voltaire or Rousseau, sort of obliquely in there, but from what I've gathered through osmosis, was sort of able to recognise that as well. And then finally, this has been quite a rambly one. I hope you forgive me for rambling on for half an hour. But I've just finished. It's technically an April book, but I read most of it in March. The selected poems of C.P. Cavafy. It was my second time reading through this, and again, I don't have too much to say. I've read some of his poems for Poetry Thursday in the past. There are two sort of main modes to his poetry. There is an examination of the classical past of ancient Greece and the pan-Hellenic world of ancient Rome and of the Byzantine Empire. He was from Alexandria, writing in the early 20th century. So there's that element, looking back. And then there's the, what's the word I'm thinking of? I suppose rather delicate expression of his own life and of liaisons with young men in cafes and memories of lost loves and things like that. And I think both of those two things together really paint a really interesting picture of both of Cavafy and of the city that he celebrates, of Alexandria, maybe at a specific time. I don't think the Alexandria that he lived in really exists anymore, and yet he also tries to connect it through time as well with these historical poems. That was the impression that I was getting from this selection. Eventually I'll maybe get the collected poems. And so that's everything that I read in March. I will quickly go through my plans for what to read or what I'll be reading in April. So in March I did read a few English ballads from Bell's English Poetry, Volume 1. I think I read 3 ballads. Let's have a look at the table of contents. Yes, so I read 4 ballads. I read London Lackpenny, which is still my favourite, about a poor man from the provinces going to London to try and get legal help, but he doesn't have any money to do anything, and it's all about, I suppose, how expensive things are in London, so things don't really change there. Then there's The Nut Brown Maid, which is essentially a knight who has to escape, and the Nut Brown Maid, his love, is trying to convince him to let her go with him, and he's just going, no, it's too dangerous and all of that, and she's like, I don't care, I love you, and it sort of takes a while. Eventually she talks him round, and it's, I suppose, a happy ending. Then there's Adam Bell, Clym of the Clough, and William of Desley, which very much felt like a sort of Robin Hood ballad, but without Robin Hood. And actually, no, they're the only 3 that I read. Because next up is A Tale of Robin Hood, which is a Robin Hood ballad proper, which I may have read in the past. I studied some Robin Hood ballads at university. So we'll see if it rings a bell. But yeah, Adam Bell is all about outlaws, and initially set in Cumbria, in Carlisle, and then it goes back down to London. It's just one mishap after the other, but it all works out in the end. And I'm finding that these are just a lovely thing to read when I'm not sure what else to read. Maybe I've just finished a chapter of a book and I'm not sure whether I want to read another chapter, and so instead I pick up a ballad, and it's been lovely. And so I'll be keeping this as a sort of book on the side to just pick up, and I'll just read a ballad whenever I'm in the mood, so eventually I'll get through the whole thing. On to my April plans proper. The only reading event I think I'll be joining in with in April is People April, and for a really long time I've been meaning to read this book, and it's The Letters of Van Gogh. So People April is a reading event all about biography and reading books about people, So all this, this is the letters, not strictly speaking, a biography of Van Gogh. And yet the selector and editor, Ronald Deleu, has sort of provided a sort of bridging material between the letters, because we only had the letters from Vincent to his brother Theo. We don't have the letters coming back, and so from things that have been garnered from family papers and other letters, he's managed to create this bridging material, so you're sort of feeling like you're sort of sweeping through his life. I've already started this. I'm only about 12 pages into the letters themselves, although there's a lovely introduction there as well that gives you a general impression of Van Gogh's life and of the relationship between Van Gogh and Theo Van Gogh. It also goes into sort of choices on the selection and the history of the letters of Van Gogh and the other selections that have been made in the past. And then this is translated then by Arnold Pomerantz. So I think it's going to be a really lovely thing to read. And already there have been just little profound things that Vincent is saying, like some advice he gives, considering that at this point he and Theo are both very, very young men. He says to his brother, "Admire as much as you can. Most people don't admire enough." And then later in the same letter, "Do go on doing a lot of walking and keep up your love of nature, for that is the right way to understand art better and better. Painters understand nature and love her and teach us to see." So it's just really lovely. So I think I'm going to enjoy this quite a lot. So that's maybe going to be a good part of my focus in April. And then I'll be picking up this Afterlife, the selected poems of A.E. Stallings, a contemporary poet that I really love, still sort of keeping a sort of Greek theme. She's an American poet, but she knows Latin, she knows Greek, she's immersed in the classical world, and she lives in Athens. So I'm still on a kind of kick, I suppose, from that book on Alexander the Great through C.P. Cavafy into A.E. Stallings. And that was the top book on my Quick to Judge challenge, a tag I did a little while ago. And I would like to get to some of the others in April. Definitely next on the list would be Agua Viva by Clarice Lispector. And then in April, I would like to pick up a little more from Michel de Montaigne and his complete essays. I've put them down for about a month, so I'm ready to pick these back up, and I'll read I think up until the section I'm up to, and then put them down for a bit longer again. And then if there's still space, if there's still time in April, I have absolutely no idea how things will go. I try to keep my plans relatively open, but we'll see. I'd like to finish off The Mirror Visitor. So the last book in that series is The Storm of Echoes. And so we'll see if I manage to finish it off. And then potentially, finally, if I've finished The Letters of Van Gogh and The Storm of Echoes and Agua Viva, I'd also like to read The Prague Cemetery by Umberto Eco, or at least start The Prague Cemetery, because I'm again very intrigued by it, and it came in third place in the Quick to Judge challenge, and so that would be the sort of next one I would like to get to. And I think that's it. So that's everything I'm planning to read in March. I apologise for how rambling this was. I was going to try and keep this relatively short, but it's gone to twice the length that I was aiming for. Maybe I need to split up my reading plans from my wrap-ups in future. We'll see what I can do. But I'll leave it there. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you're doing well. I hope that you had a lovely March. And yeah, my best wishes for April. So yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.